My childhood priest, the priest that I was talking to that I used to go to is a molester. Actually, all three of the priests in my parish were on the list. I think it's called Sylvia's List for Ontario. If any of your viewers are interested, if there's a thing called Sylvia's List, it lists all the Catholic priests who have been, formally sanctioned or whatever by the church.
Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to Ramacro. I'm extremely excited because, as many of you know, I enjoy sharing experiences from others who've been affected by cult-like groups. Today, I'm going to be speaking to someone who wasn't raised in the Jehovah's Witness organization, but was certainly raised with a set of beliefs that were extremely controlling. Jo Pavlov, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the channel.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you were raised in, and I had to do some research on this because it slipped my radar. You were raised in the Charismatic Movement, is that right?
Yeah. So mainstream Catholic to a certain point. And then when my mom discovered the Charismatic angle, she really latched onto that. I was about maybe 7 or 8 when that happened, and that was kind of how we proceeded with our Catholicism.
Okay.
It came about in the early 80s, and it was not unlike Pentecostalism in mainstream Christianity. So there was this real heavy emphasis on speaking in tongues, being slain in the spirit. It was like my mom would faint on the altar. It was really meant to get away from this angry God, this vengeful God, and it wanted to bring a sense of a loving God. And so for that, I am somewhat grateful that my childhood was filled with a loving, gracious God, a lot of singing and a lot of dancing, but a lot of strange cult-like behaviors as well, So It was part of Roman Catholicism. It was accepted by the church, but it was a faction called the Charismatic Movement or the Renew Movement. And I think it still exists. I'm pretty sure it still exists.
Well, in the minimal sort of research I've done, because I wanted to hear as much as possible sort of from the horse's mouth, but as I understand it, the Charismatic Movement first began in 1960 in Anglicanism, and it sort of branched out into other denominations and reached Catholicism by 1967. So presumably by the time you were being raised, it was fairly well established in Catholicism. So it sounds like, rather than it being like a strictly Catholic thing, it's this, you could say, fundamentalist form of worship that had a very how could I put it? It was transferable kind of interdenominationally, if that makes sense. Does that sound right?
The thing with Catholics is you're never going to get interdenominational anything. So Catholics are right and everything else is wrong. So in fact, I can tell you a quip. By the way, a lot of my story today you're going to be hearing me talk about my mother. So my mother was she was the one who was the religious person in our lives, and whatever she taught me is what I absorbed and what I believed. So I remember when I was a little kid, Mommy, what's the difference between Catholics and Protestants? And she would say, Catholics are going to heaven and Protestants are going to hell. Straight up, that was the answer. So no, there was no interdenominational. This Renew movement in Catholicism was distinctly Catholic from what I recall. Now, I was a child. I was born in 1972. So by 1980, I would have been 8. And that's roughly around the time we started. And again, I have no concept of how other religions, I have Googled it, and I'm curious as to how other Christian denominations did it.
Embraced that form of worship. This is kind of what I'm trying to get my head around, is that, I sort of understand a little bit about Catholicism because, when I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, we'd repeatedly speak to Catholics in our preaching work, and that necessitates learning at least a little bit about what Catholics believe and how they worship. But it fascinates me that there was this, how can I put it, this interpretation of Catholicism that with this brand of the charismatic movement, and yet there were other denominations that used this charismatic movement brand, even though the theology was, as you say, it completely cancelled out other denominations.
Yeah, I don't know how Catholics, squared that in their head, because Catholics are notorious for not wanting to change. I mean, again, going back to my mother, she was born in 41, so she was raised what I call an Angela's Ashes style Catholic. I don't know if you've ever read that book or seen that movie, but my mother's experience was almost identical to Frank McCourt. So it was very, masses were in Latin. Priests and nuns would come down out of the pulpit and smack you my father has ringing in one ear from being smacked by a priest. My mom has a pencil hole from where a nun rammed her when she was misbehaving in class. Like, they had a terrible old school Catholic upbringing. Come the 60s, when Vatican II came along, that was Pope John the 23rd, in Roman Catholicism, he kind of revolutionized Roman Catholicism to speak, in the vernacular. So it was English masses. There was a lot of changes, and a lot of old school Catholics really did not like those changes at all. And my mom embraced them, and my family embraced them. I mean, I remember going to church as a child, and it was always in English, and we always sang songs, and it was a loving God. It was, I don't remember it being terribly fire and brimstone. But then the charismatic movement took it a step further, where I do remember people at my school, and I'll get back to that in a second. I did go to Catholic school, would say, like, what's Jo going to? What is this charismatic thing? A lot of mainstream Catholics were skeptical that it wasn't real Catholicism. And I remember being told, oh, no, we've squared this with the Pope. We've squared this with the bishop. It's good to go. The bishop has accepted this as actual Catholicism.
Have the green light from the Pope.
Yeah. By the way, Catholicism is totally authoritarian. So, like the governing body, you always need a thumbs up from somebody, a priest or a bishop, somebody in authority, in order to really do anything. Yeah.
Okay. So, you mentioned that your parents had a very strict upbringing. Yeah. And you also mentioned earlier that you feel grateful in a way that there was love in your upbringing. So, how would you characterize your upbringing as being both loving and controlling? Yeah,
this is, cognitive dissonance 101. I was raised by a lot of my friends' standards to be an extreme Catholic, like an extremely devout Catholic. I had a mother who embraced it fully, and I embraced it fully. So I believed whatever I was taught. If they said jump, I said how high. So as a good Catholic, I knew this, that, and the other was a sin. By the way, it's almost always sexual, right? Everything in Catholicism, sexual thoughts are sinful. I remember we were allowed to watch, violence on TV. But we weren't allowed to watch like a stupid show like Three's Company because it had sexual overtones or whatever. So I remember being like drinking the Kool-Aid and following the dogma to the letter, whatever the church said. I did believe, I embraced wholeheartedly. By the way, I left the church when I was 18. So this is predominantly childhood and teenage stuff. So I like to think, I had some concept of I knew what I was doing. However, I was being brainwashed. I was okay with the heavy-handedness of the Catholic Church. I was fine with the judgmentalism. I was, I think, by nature, a very judgmental person, and I didn't mind having this "you're right, you're wrong" philosophy. And then when we would go to church, the singing and the dancing, it's very strange. I mean, this charismatic Catholicism is a lot of just strange worship practices that were new to us, but to an 8-year-old kid or to a 10-year-old kid, it's fun, right? And there was a real sense of, they call it the Renew movement, and it has a lot to do with the Holy Spirit. And truth be told, I wish I had more to tell you about the Holy Spirit, but the Trinity, are JWs Trinity-based?
They're strictly non-Trinitarian.
Okay, yeah. So in the Trinity system, it's the God, the Son, God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And the Renew movement was really big into the Holy Spirit, which I don't know that I could really explain that to you other than you were slain in the Spirit. You accepted the Spirit. The Spirit would fill you as you were dancing and singing and speaking in tongues. And I don't remember being thrown off by that. I thought it was totally normal. I thought it was great that my mom was so happy. I mean, it really brought joy to her life. And meanwhile, in the back of all of this was me living my life. I remember in grade 6, so I would have been about 12 years old. I went to French class, and she had done, I guess, just a bunch of words, and it had to do with astrology signs. So like Leos are proud, or Aries, or I don't know. She just had this list, of French words. And I remember my eyes popping out of my head and running straight to the principal and saying, the French teacher put occult on the board. Like, this is astrology. This is a sin. And I remember, just in my right mind, acting like there was no problem ratting this teacher out. And the next day it was gone. It was off the board. So I was always a very good little Catholic, doing my duty, getting rid of whatever sin was in my way. I have vivid memories of being a teenager, finding out that some of my friends had had sex before marriage. I have vivid memory of standing at a party. I must have been about 16, screaming at my best friend, calling her a slut. She had been with her boyfriend for a year at that point. And of course, premarital sex is a sin. So I was very badly behaved. I was a very mean person. I was a very judgmental and angry person, like righteous anger. And it doesn't really square with the charismatic movement, but I always knew, so to speak, that Jesus loved me. I knew that, I felt that, that Jesus was that God was a loving God to us, to Catholics. There was, for instance, the gay thing. I remember I had a lot of gay friends as a teenager, and I remember my mom saying, oh, well, you have to love the sinner and hate the sin. And I just accepted that as a completely rational concept. So I don't know, there was a sense of loving. Like if you'd asked me then, are you a loving person? I would have said, yeah. And yet I was behaving in very unloving ways towards people, friends,
Yeah, I guess, there's always going to be this contrast, isn't there? And I think many viewers watching this who've been Jehovah's Witnesses like myself will entirely relate to what you're saying, because on the one hand, it's supposed to be all about love, and Jehovah's Witnesses call it the love that never fails. But when you have a very authoritarian kind of religion, or especially a religion that's very rule-based, and as you put it, obsessed with sexual immorality in particular, it's going to manifest itself inevitably in a judgmentalism that entirely contradicts the concept of being loving. Because if you're truly loving, then you're accepting, aren't you? You accept people for who they are. But
and I know
when you have all of these rules that you're required to live by, it's human nature, isn't it, that you're going to want to enforce those rules on other people around you.
And you think you're being loving by disassociating or disconnecting. I remember we found out my sister was on the pill when I would have been about 15, she would have been about 16. I do remember my mom, my dad, and I did not speak to her for many months. I don't remember the time exactly, but we thought we were being loving. And I know you know this as a former JW. It's, by shunning them, you're hoping that act will spark them into behaving or coming back to the fold or whatever. I don't know what we were thinking. We just didn't speak to her. She lived in the house and we just didn't speak to her, as if she was a non-entity.
And how long did this go on for, this shunning?
I have no recollection. I think it was in the neighborhood of months, may have been a year. My sister and I are very close now, exceptionally close. And we talk a lot about our childhood. And it's funny because I very much identify as a recovering cult member, and she does not. So we have mutual friends who will say things like, have I ever, Anne Marie is my sister. She said to her friend, have I ever once talked to you about being raised in a cult? And our friend Carolyn will go, no. And meanwhile, I'm sitting there going, oh, I'm a total cult survivor, because I drank the Kool-Aid in a way she didn't. I was a true believer. She never was. She was a good Catholic kid who went to mass and did what she had to do to, I think most, we call them Sunday Catholics or whatever, or Christmas Catholics, just do, they're not really 100% into it, whereas I was. But my sister and I have talked about the shunning. She has a lot of religious trauma that she's only now coming to terms with. She never correlated the two. She never correlated the two in her head, that the way we were treating her and the way society was treating her. I mean, we went to Catholic school. I was going to tell you a little bit about that. In Ontario, I live in Ontario, Canada. It's actually the law. It's part constitutional. You can Google it. Ontario gives full funding to Catholic schools, which means they're publicly funded. So there are as many Catholic schools in our city as there are public schools. And so anybody can go to a Catholic school. You don't have to be Catholic to go to Catholic school, but you get a Catholic education. And, we wore the kilts, the schoolgirl uniforms, whatever. And my sister, in the 80s had big hair and a short skirt. And she was that typical slutty schoolgirl that she was mocked mercilessly. She was judged heavily because she was a teenage girl who liked big hair in the 80s and liked having a short skirt. And so she's now coming to terms with a lot of the way she was treated by us, her family, and society at large for being just being herself, being a normal sexual 16-year-old girl. She may or may not have had, whatever desires 16-year-old girls have. I was kind of an interesting case in that I didn't have much of a sex drive, or if I did, I knew how to thought stop it. I was very good at thought stopping it. I knew it was a sin, so I knew I wasn't allowed to think about it, so I didn't. And I look back on it now, and I know I have this nature now where I can frequently talk myself out of thoughts. It's a gift and a curse, to have been taught those thought stopping techniques young. You're not allowed to think those things, so don't. And I was very good at, I guess, picking up where the church left off on the brainwashing side. I refer heavily to Stephen Hassan's bite model. That's kind of how I started to realize I had a lot of cult-like thinking, because it was behaviors and thoughts that I was very good at capping if I had to. I just did what I had to do to be a good Catholic. It was very important to me to be a good Catholic, both in thought.
It creates a lot of kind of guilt, though, doesn't it? Because I understand I think I understand what you're saying. You're saying that, if a thought popped into your head that was sort of immoral, or that was, in some way wrong according to your, religion, you were able to kind of start thinking about something different.
Oh yeah.
In some way. And I think, I can pretty much relate to that. It's just that, the way it's pitched when you're a Jehovah's Witness is that just having the thought to begin with is a bad thing,
Mm-hmm.
And if you really have a pure personality, these sorts of things aren't going to even spring into your head. And
Right.
if they do spring into your head, you need to have mastery over them. And it sounds like a mastery that you kind of perfected almost, but as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty much thought crime, because your brain's going to do whatever your brain's going to do.
Right.
What matters is whether you act on it or not,
So I have a vivid childhood memory. Again, Catholics are not Bible-based, believe it or not. It's very dogma-based. So if you have a question, you go to a priest. You don't really open the Bible and look for answers there. But I knew enough of the Bible to be able to quote it here and there if I needed some ammunition. I remember my friend and I were having a fight. I must have been about, 10 years old. And I screamed at her, "You're a fool." And then it hit me that there's that line in the Bible about a man who calls another man a fool will never go through the gates of. I'm sure if Tibor is gracious, we can get a line here about
we'll see what Tibor can do there. Yeah.
There is a famous line about calling another man a fool and never being able to go through the gates of heaven. I remember running home. I remember laying under my bed crying. My mom was like, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And I didn't want to tell her. I couldn't tell her. I had committed a mortal sin. I was going to hell. I had called her a fool. And it's funny, that thought came into my head and the word came out of my mouth. And I was usually very good at thought stopping. I don't know what prompted me to call her a fool that day, but there you have it. It came out of my mouth. And unbelievable, just unbelievable how I knew, I knew that was a sin.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
And you again, had this guilt.
Yeah.
And I think, making children in particular guilty over such frankly trivial stuff is really cruel. And, I'm just wondering to what extent you feel that your childhood impacted or the way you were raised, religiously, to what extent did it impact on who you are as a person now?
Everything I am today is a result of the trajectory of my life. It started that way. I can tell you my breakaway story. When I was 18, I spent the next 20 years, from 18 to 38, assuming there was a God. I guess I was a pantheist or a Buddhist, or I just always had this sensation there was something. There had to be something. Guilt. It's interesting because Catholics have a get out of jail free card. There's confession. So in the Catholic world, you can go to confession. It's a thing. It's a sacrament. You go to the church, you sit in a little booth, and you tell the priest your sins, and he absolves you. So you can always get forgiven right then and there. If I'm pretty sure probably after that fool comment, I probably ran to confession the next available opportunity and got forgiven. So therefore I was able to just, okay, so now I'm back in the good books. I can go to heaven now. Oh, by the way, in Catholicism too, you can wear a scapular. Have you ever heard of a scapular?
The name rings a bell, but I'd love you to explain it. Go on.
It's a little piece of cardboard or whatever, and these fabric. It's a necklace, but it's some saint somebody. If you die wearing a scapular, you go to heaven. This is insane. This is like, be the big sinner, do whatever you want. But if you die wearing a scapular, you go to heaven.
Maybe if Tibor is gracious, we can quickly show a picture of what the scapular is.
It's funny. I didn't wear it all day, every day. I think once you know that as a Catholic, you're like, oh, this is great. I'll just wear this for the rest of my life. Or you go to confession and you confess, and then you are forgiven, you're absolved, and you can go about your life. But you have to go to confession regularly, and you're taught. I remember my sister and I had this conversation. I never had trouble, even though I was an exceptionally good kid. I didn't sin. I remember coming up with sins because, and it wasn't a hard task to, for instance, I remember I was sitting in classroom one day and nobody was in there and I had to erase something. I grabbed an eraser off of somebody's desk, erased it, and put it back. And then I looked at the erasure, the crumbs of the eraser on the page. And that was stolen property to me. In my mind, my child's mind, that I had stolen that eraser. Although I gave it back, the crumbs were stolen property. I do remember confessing that. I remember going into the confession.
It'd be pretty hard to put a value, in terms of reimbursing your classmate. This is how many kind of, I don't know what currency is it, cents? This is how many cents I owe you, yeah.
And I don't feel like, the guilt is instantaneous. The guilt you're feeling at that moment. You're just constantly a sinner. You're a sinner. You're constantly going to sin. So at least you can wear the scapular. At least you can go to confession, and then you can get back on your high horse and judge everybody else for their bad behavior or the fact that they're not going to confession. I should add that in Catholicism, you're baptized at birth. You confess and have a First Holy Communion where you wear the Bride of Christ outfit. You marry Jesus. It's called a First Holy Communion and confession at age 7, which I guess the Catholic Church has determined to be the age of reason. At age 13, so grade 7, you get confirmed, where you confirm your Catholicism. So there's these spots along the way where, as a good Catholic, you have to do these things. And I did them very willingly, very much embraced, drank the Kool-Aid, and loved it. Loved being, in my right mind at the age of 13, telling the world and that I am Catholic, not knowing any other option, not having any other, going to Catholic school, being immersed in it and having no other idea. I should tell you, I was almost converted to JW in grade 11. I somehow convinced my mother to let me go to a public school. I transferred out of Catholic and into a public school when I was 16 years old. And the first girls who were kind to me at the cafeteria table, first day of grade 11, Barb and Jenny, I will never forget them. And one of the conversations we had was, I don't know, probably religion comes up a lot with me. It's one of my favorite subjects. So they knew, and I was fresh meat to them. So then the Awake magazines and the Watchtowers would start showing up. And one of the things I remember with Barb, because I heavily believed in Armageddon. I heavily believed that the world was ending in my lifetime. And I remember Barb specifically said, she was a very bright girl. She was in one of my classes. She was a straight A student. And she said, I want to be a doctor, but there's no point in becoming a doctor because the world's ending in 1999. This would have been 88. She said, so I'm going to become a nurse because that's 2 or 3 years of post-secondary versus 12. And that way, at least, I can do a few years of nursing before the end times. And I vividly remember thinking that she was very smart, that was a good idea. That's what she should do. she should not educate herself, and she should be a nurse, because I believed the end was coming. And she pretty much had me convinced it was coming in 99 as well. Is 99 a Jehovah's Witness date? Is that one of them?
Oh, it's a tricky one. I have actually done a video, if Tibor is gracious, a thumbnail will appear to a 1989 watchtower that suggested that the end was going to come before the end of the 20th century. Yeah. But they actually got rid of they edited out the sentence by the time the same magazine had appeared in the bound volume. Okay. So you can find quotes that hint very strongly at the end coming before the end of the 20th century, but it certainly wasn't like I can remember it not being a thing for me that the end was coming in 1999.
I think it was one generation of the Great War or something. So if people were still alive who had fought in World War I, which would make sense.
Yeah, they had the generation teaching. Yeah.
So I remember, even as a Catholic, I remember asking my mom, because I got into Revelation. I read the book of Revelation. I was like, what the heck is this? And my mom was like, yeah, don't put too much, don't go ask the priest. She would always just tell me to go talk to the priest instead of trying to look for answers in the Bible. But I remember being fascinated by the book of Revelation. Like, how did I not know this was going to happen? And so when the Jehovah's Witnesses were kind to me in high school, I befriended them in a heartbeat, and they very, very nearly had me converted. I was strong enough in my Catholicism that I didn't want to go down that road, but we had similar beliefs, and I took them very seriously, and they were very kind. I've always thought Jehovah's Witnesses are some of the kindest people you'll ever meet. Mind you, I've never been shunned by one, so I guess, I have. And Catholics to me are some of the meanest people you'll ever meet. They're very, in my experience, and I shouldn't, speaking of a worldwide number, don't they say there's 1 billion Catholics or some such ridiculous number? My name would be on that list because I was baptized Catholic. I guess when they're running up the roster of how many worldwide Catholics there are, I'm still on that list. And so some years ago, when I became an atheist, I started my journey to atheism at about the age of 38, probably by the age of maybe 35. And by about 39 or 40, I could say I am an atheist. It was a long journey. It was a very long journey. But around that time, I remember I wanted to be excommunicated. I really wanted like a frameable piece of paper. I wanted so I remember
you wanted a trophy.
But I wanted my name off that list. I think anybody who's a fallen away Catholic should do what they have to do to get off that list. And so I remember emailing the bishop and saying, how do it turns out there's 7 ways to be excommunicated from the Catholic Church. And 4 of them have to do with papal, something's like only a pope. 3 of them apply to humanity. 1 is something apostasy, heresy, schism. 1 is procuring an abortion. I don't remember the other one. So I remember in this letter I'd written to the bishop, I said, I'm a vocal heretic. You can see my YouTube channel, or you can see my, I think at the time I was on a TV show. I ran in a political party here in Canada some years ago. And so I was on a TV show for just roundtable political call-in show. So I said something like, oh, you can see my heretical views on this talk show. I said, I will provide receipts for Planned Parenthood. I've procured abortions. The bishop's secretary wrote me back and said, you should, she was very polite. She said, you can bring your baptismal certificate to the parish where you were baptized and ask to be stricken from the record. And I was like, who the hell has their baptismal? Like, you think I carry a baptismal certificate around with me? And I'm going to go down there and be stricken. I don't want to be stricken from the record. I want to be excommunicated. But one of the things that held me back from actually pursuing that was my mom. My mom is devout. My mom is 81 years old. She's currently in a nursing home in long-term care, and she's got severe dementia. And a lot of it, interestingly, a lot of her dementia comes out in cult. Like she thinks there's cults around her. It's very religious based, very strange. But in the years that my mom did not have dementia, I never wanted to break her heart. And I knew she knows who I am. She's very well aware that I'm an atheist, and a pretty vocal one at that. But I didn't want to just cause her undue hardship. So I never pursued it, but it was something I wanted to. I definitely wanted to.
So I want to kind of a little bit revisit your kind of deconversion story, but there's one thing that you said when you were talking about your kind of brush with Jehovah's Witnesses that I found intriguing, because it's not something that I really associate with Catholicism, and that's your belief in Armageddon, even as a Catholic, because when I think of kind of mainstream quote unquote Christianity, including Catholicism, I'm not really associating it with the same kind of doomsday ideology that you see in groups like Jehovah's Witnesses. Generally speaking, it seems to be all about almost Christianizing the world as much as possible, and leading by example, and in some kind of abstract way, the kingdom of God will be manifested on the earth in that way. So how does Catholicism interpret Armageddon?
Again, I haven't been a Catholic in 30 years. I don't know the current state of things. When I was a Catholic, I do remember it's in the Bible. You can read Revelations, and it's all about the end times. So it is a given that it's going to happen. How much emphasis, I guess, is most Christian denominations and Catholicism do not place a high, we don't spend a lot of time talking about Armageddon. That's really not front of mind, because we don't know the date or the hour. Whereas JW really do like to play with that date and hour, and some other Christian denominations as well, where they really want to talk about, and I know JW in particular is very big on the 144,000 who have already been named or whatever going to the heaven, but there's that middle tier, to people who live on earth in paradise. I do remember Barb telling me about that at lunch hour, how there will be a paradise on earth, and I remember having a bit of a question. I didn't recall that being part of Catholicism, and when in doubt, I always took the side of the Catholic at that time in my life. So whatever she was telling me didn't really ring true, but I do know Catholics and Christians in general do believe in the end times. They just don't harp on it. They tend not to worry too much about it, and they don't get right down to the nitty gritty like JWs do about who and when and how and like who's going to be saved and under what circumstances and what will it look like. I've been watching your videos for years, Lloyd, and I love some of the those, just the clips you show from the jw.org. These, people running through fields of blood, like what the heck? And they're all clothed and they're all eating. I remember one of your videos, you was like, who made those pots and pans? Like, who made that table? Who's the carpenter who made the table that they're eating at in these end times? Like, just illogic. But again, all of religion, all of Christianity is illogical. And I know some of your deconversion had to do with you need evidence. You're an evidence-based atheist. And that wasn't so much true for me, because I never needed evidence in my lifetime before. Why would I need it now? I have come to be an evidence-based thinker, but I didn't need proof. I never needed proof. And this is what's unfortunate, is that when you teach a child from birth, I was indoctrinated from birth to think a certain way, and other ways of thinking were poo-pooed. So I didn't think that way. I remember asking logical questions, and they would be like, well, just go ask the priest. Like, it was just such a strange way to raise children, to always defer to an authority. You can have questions, but the priest will give you some, I did go to the priest from time to time. I would go to him and ask him questions. I don't ever remember getting specific answers, but whatever. I just went along my merry way. My deconversion started, and again, it has to do with sexual sins of sex. A childhood friend I had was, one of 7 or 8 kids. There was the 7-year-old, the 6-year-old, the 5-year-old, the 4-year-old, like a Irish Catholic family. And one day I remember my mom saying, oh, Mrs. C got her tubes tied. There won't be any more kids in that family. And I said, what's that, Mom? And she said, oh, that's when you don't want any more children. You don't want any more gifts from God. So it's a mortal sin where you refuse any more gifts of children from God. and you have a surgery to prevent that. And Mrs. C is going to hell. I remember her telling me that. And I was horrified why anyone would choose this. Why would you choose to go to hell? You know, she had 8 children, but that's beside the point. So flash forward when I was 18, I was on the phone with my sister and she said, did you ever wonder why there's only 2 of us? I said, no. And she said, you know, Mom had her tubes tied after you were born, right? And I said, what? I said, that's impossible. Mom, there's just no way. She had that's a mortal sin. And she said, no, call her and ask her. So I did. And I'll never forget this conversation with my mom. She was bawling her eyes out. I was bawling my eyes out. She said, you know, she had been suicidally depressed after the birth of my sister. She was postpartum, probably psychosis. She had gone to the priest and said, you know, I'm not coping. My husband wants sex. I am, you know, as a Catholic, you have to put out, you have to be available to your husband. By the way, one thing Mom did teach us was that if you refuse your husband sex and he masturbates, the sin's on you for not having given it to him. You know, we can go into the women and how women are treated in the Catholic Church, but she knew that here she was with an infant and she was going to have sex with her husband, whether she wanted to or not. And she was going to get pregnant in short order, whether she wanted to or not. She had asked the priest for permission to go on the pill. He said no. She did anyway, in between my sister and I, for about 6 months. And she said every day she took the pill, she was sinning. So one day the guilt just overtook her and she stopped and she got pregnant with me immediately. My sister and I are 18 months apart. I'm a straight up Catholic guilt baby. I'm on this planet because the guilt overtook her. So now she has 2 babies in diapers and postpartum depression. She went to the priest and said, I can't cope. I can't do this. And he said, too bad. You have to have sex with your husband and you have to have as many children as God gives you. And my mom went back on the pill, took the pill every day, sin. And she realized, oh my God, I could get a tubal ligation and just one big sin and be done with it. And then I can repent for the rest of my life. So when we were on the phone discussing this, she said, I made a choice to have a tubal ligation and to repent for the rest of my life. So the day that we had that conversation on the phone, she said, you know, I pray every day for forgiveness from God that I committed this mortal sin. And I was freaking out. I was 18 years old. And I said, where is Dad in this equation? Why doesn't he have to? He's going to heaven, clearly, but you get to go to hell because you made a choice that every woman on this planet has made at some point in her life. You get to go to hell. I was furious. And I remember her just saying, you don't understand. It's a woman's plight. And, you know, she to this day, she thinks she prays every day for forgiveness for that one mortal sin. And that was it. That was the breaking point. If you'd have told me that I wasn't going to be Catholic that at the age of 8, I wouldn't have believed you because there wasn't much that led up to that crack. That crack was very, very violent and it happened in an instant. And I remember thinking no God does that to my mother. Like whatever God is doing that to my mother's no God of mine. You can't treat half the human population that way. I just couldn't even. And I mean, I didn't even want to have sex and I didn't even want to have, these things weren't even on my mind. I was 18, pretty virginal.
It was purely thinking of, you know, basically putting yourself in your mother's shoes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And just being furious that she had felt the need to keep this secret for so long. You know, again, we were in that charismatic movement where she was surrounded by a loving church family. But she was kind of alone in her, you know, she would just go to her parish priest for a lot of the answers. And he wasn't charismatic. The charismatic church that we went to was, you know, some kilometers away. Like we would drive there to go there. But our parish priests, you know, they were just normal run-of-the-mill Catholics with the normal run-of-the-mill Catholic values. So I don't think she had a lot of support in her decision. I think, and have I talked to my dad? I don't think my dad had anything to say about it. He didn't really want kids to begin with. I mean, kids came as a result of having sex, and having sex is just something you do. So, you know, I don't think having a vasectomy was even on his radar, which is interesting. But yeah, that was sort of the breaking point for me, was my mom's realizing that this church treated women that way. And it's not like I didn't know. I mean, I did a project in grade 10, I remember, about pulling all the biblical verses I could about marriage. And it's all wives submit yourselves to your husband as to the Lord, and women don't speak in church, and women cover your heads. And women will never have authority over men. I knew these things logically. I just didn't, I don't know, cognitive dissonance. What can I say? Like, you just accept it. And then one day it became very real. There was my mom. You don't treat my mom that way. You just don't do that to some poor woman making a reproductive choice. Yeah.
Wow. So that was you could say, the straw that broke the camel's back. And then you spent the next 20 years kind of grappling with this idea of, okay, the religion of my childhood wasn't true, but there's some kind of God or other. I just need to find who it is.
Fathom a world without a God, but not a mean God, not a God that does that to my mother, and not a biblical God. I often quip that the journey to atheism is frequently Christianity to Catholic to maybe mainstream Christianity-ish. I don't think I dabbled in mainstream Christianity. But the next step is usually pantheism, where you kind of believe in a God, but just doesn't really have a name. It's kind of out there. Or I like to say, like, a divine plan of goodness for me. Around that time, on a sideways note, I got involved in 12 steps. I've come from an alcoholic family. So I was in a 12-step program. There's a lot about this higher power. So you just have to believe in a higher power. And I just thought, okay, so there is a higher power, whatever that is. The next step to atheism is sometimes Buddhism. So you kind of just believe in karma or just justice, kind of. The journey from probably that to atheism was the hardest leap of all. But I do remember, and it was through YouTube. It was through YouTube, atheist YouTubers back in like 2008, 9, 10. I remember the day I uttered the word atheist. I just, this beam of light that I just felt like, oh my God, this is the answer I was looking for my whole life. This is what freedom is not. I never knew what freedom was till I became an atheist. I know, because it's just such a tangled way to live. You constantly, Catholic guilt. I'm sure you've met Catholics in your life. Catholic guilt is just something, I'm 50 years old. I fight with this constantly. You feel guilty about all sorts of things. You've been born that way to be that way. So that's how you're wired. Yeah.
I guess, my perspective now is a little bit more, how can I put it, relaxed from when I first became an atheist. When I first became an atheist, I kind of had this this drive to kind of shout from the rooftops sort of thing. And I still do feel the need to speak out against religion and just be honest with my viewers. I think I owe it to my viewers to share what I know about the Bible in particular and the harm that religion can cause. But if I'm thinking about whether I want my viewers to join me in atheism, I can't really say that I do feel that way per se. I feel as though life's super complicated, and people's kind of mental health challenges can manifest themselves in all manner of ways, and who am I to kind of wish to dabble in the coping mechanisms that people develop to get through life. So I kind of feel now as though, whatever gets you through the week, you go for it. But I reserve the right to kind of reject it for myself, and also, call out nonsense publicly if it doesn't make any logical sense, if that makes any sense to you.
Yeah, I envy you because I'm not there yet, and I wish I was. I am an evangelical atheist, and it is my mission in life to convert people to atheism to an obnoxious degree. And I look in the mirror and I acknowledge, like, I know who I am, and I know this is not a quality that I. However, I was always a zealot. I was always passionate. Catholicism is not a door knocking conversion religion. We don't want to convert people to Catholicism specifically. But I always knew I was right and they were wrong. And I currently feel like I'm right and they're wrong. So why wouldn't I want to share the truth? And I've been in trouble several times at work because I have a very big mouth. And at work, they call me in for talking about religion and politics. And I get my wrist slapped and I promise I won't do it again. But we had a co-op
You've
kid.
You've been in the HR department a few times, shall we say?
And we had a co-op kid. Several of our co-op kids come from a Christian school, a private Christian school. And I've done my due diligence. I've done my duty. I try and I drop breadcrumbs when I can. And one of the co-op kids came back to me. I remember he was a high school co-op kid, and then he came back 3 years later when he was a college co-op kid. And he said to me, "Jo, you'll be really thrilled to know this." He goes, "I no longer believe abortion is a sin in the case of incest." And I just, my heart, like, to get a kid from A to B, to get a kid to think even that. And I know, having gone through a deconversion process, that is the biggest leap, just to get away from that black and white thinking to a little bit of gray. So I just felt like I'd done my due diligence. Oh my God, I've started this kid on a path of questioning, or I shouldn't be such an evangelist. I envy you, because your channel is it's a gentle, a gentle approach to people who watch you gets the seeds planted. And of course, that's the gift, right? The gift you give is, you can never convert somebody with, knocking on their door. You can only convert them by giving them things to think about, street epistemology. Or I loved what you did with the Mormons. That was one of my favorite segments you did. I'm obsessed with Mormons. You were very respectful and kind to them. Even when you were standing at the, what are those called in the mall where just the JWs stand with their magazines?
You mean the carts?
Carts. Yeah. You stood and talked to some JWs, just gently, dropping a breadcrumb here and there. And I mean, maybe one day I'll get to that point where that's all I want. But I do, I am 50 years old and I have come so far. And I do believe whatever gets you through the night. My dad, for example, and I have developed a new relationship since my mom got put in long-term care. My dad and I are very close in a way we weren't in my lifetime. And my dad, believe it or not, is a biblical creationist. He believes the world is 6,000 years old. And that's not a typical Catholic belief. The vast majority of Catholics don't believe that. They're fine with, modern, we didn't evolve from monkeys, so to speak, but, it took millennia. But I was talking to my dad, and my dad has some very strange Christian beliefs. My dad's the kind of guy, when he has a question to the universe, he plops the Bible open and points to a passage, and that's the answer he wants. Like, he is a religious man. And I've come to accept, and my mom is still very religious, even in her late stage of dementia. And I love them. And when you love people who have wrong beliefs, I have to accept that it is what gives them comfort and peace. I've stopped trying to convert my dad. I've stopped trying to convert my mom, but I never stopped dropping breadcrumbs, because that is something, I feel pretty passionate about. I wish I could just accept it, but I can't. I'm just not cut from that.
Well, I think there's a balance, to be honest. And it's like, the mantra that I live by is some words by Christopher Hitchens. The grave will supply plenty of time for silence. And I really do believe that. I believe as much as I try to, just let people do whatever gets them through the week, I also think that by the same token, life's too short to shut up if you have something to say, or if you know something to be true or not true, and feel a need to say what's what, So I think there's definitely something to be said for speaking your truth, and I'm very, very grateful that you've been able to do that on my channel today. I do have a couple more questions for you, though, before I let you go. Yeah. With Jehovah's Witnesses and Catholicism, there's a bit of an overlap when it comes to child abuse, in that there's a thing called the clergy penitent privilege that priests basically use to get out of mandatory reporting requirements in countries like the United States. So if there's a state where you are, it's the law for you to report knowledge of child abuse, you can kind of get off the hook if you find out about it because you're a priest and it's been divulged in a confessional. And Jehovah's Witnesses point to this when they're defending their mismanagement of child abuse, and say, well, the Catholics have their provision, so why can't we have something similar? They even went to the Supreme Court and said, our interfaith communications, in other words, our secret database, should have the same protections that the Catholic confessional has.
It's disgusting.
Unfortunately, the Supreme Court just shrugged it off. I doubt the Supreme Court right now would have shrugged it off, but that's probably another conversation. But I did once interview a Catholic priest who'd previously been a Jehovah's Witness, and the interview never got, and the interview was never aired for various reasons. But there was one really chilling moment in our conversation where the priest said something along the lines of, "You have to understand, Lloyd, the confessional is sacred, and it's so sacred that if a man confessed in the booth, what's the name of it? Sorry,
confessional booth. Yep.
Yeah. If a man confessed that he had poisoned the wine that's supposed to be used in communion, I would have to leave the booth and serve the wine as though it hadn't been poisoned, even if it meant killing everyone." That's how seriously I take the confessional. And I was genuinely kind of shocked by that, because that's extremism, that's fanaticism, that when you're willing to kill people, essentially, for your faith, you're just a hop, skip, and a jump away from a suicide bomber, in my opinion.
Oh, exactly. I went to St. Lawrence Elementary, which one of the Canadian martyr. No, he's a martyr. I remember being told that being a martyr was the greatest thing you could ever be, and then came suicide bombers. Being taught that to die for your faith would be the greatest thing you could ever do. I don't know how. I would say Catholics get away with a lot of like the child abuse scandal. I'm not American, so I don't know much about the Supreme Court, but I know worldwide Catholic priests have that confessional right to not have to testify or whatever. Probably because it's just an old religion. Like, it's just, I think JW is so new, it's considered a cult by most. I think most news sources would consider JW to be a cult. In a way, they just don't consider Catholicism to be Catholicism or just mainstream Christianity. Yeah, it's disgusting. It's disgusting. The child abuse, the way it was covered up, the way priests were just shuffled from one diocese to another to, and everyone knows, my dad's generation, in particular my parents' generation, everyone knows a priest. My childhood priest, the priest that I was talking to that I used to go to is a molester. Actually, all three of the priests in my parish were on the list. I think it's called Sylvia's List for Ontario. If any of your viewers are interested, if there's a thing called Sylvia's List, it lists all the Catholic priests who have been, formally sanctioned or whatever by the church. All three of my childhood parish priests were molesters, all of them. Yeah, and they get away with it. I don't even know what to say. It's disgusting.
It's, and again, I think with the clergy penitent privilege, that kind of highlights the extent to which Catholicism in particular has kind of managed to leverage this kind of, how can I put it? It's managed to influence politics, essentially. Yeah. It's managed to kind of give itself its own pass. And it frustrates me as a Brit because, I was a core participant in the inquiry into child sexual abuse, independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. And I feel like I saw firsthand the deference to religion in the UK. And I feel as though when you're writing laws to allow religions to essentially cover up crime, I can't think of a worse example of not just religious deference, but quite frankly, corruption. Yeah. And it just seems to me that so much needs to change. And it shouldn't even be a conversation as far as I'm concerned. Children need to be protected. And although I can understand there being some kind of virtue in having some kind of mechanism whereby people can express things that they feel guilty about and I can understand there being a need for that, both secularly and religiously, having some kind of outlet where you can say, look, I did this thing that I feel really, really bad about. You know, how do I manage these feelings, which is essentially what we're talking about. But, you know, when we're talking about crime, especially of a sexual nature, I just do not care. That needs to go straight to the police. And unfortunately, lawmakers don't feel the same way.
Yeah. The good news is Ratzinger, stage name Benedict, recently died, and he was that, what did they call him, God's Rottweiler or whatever. He was part of the problem of that cover up. This new pope, I mean, I think they're all the same. I think this new pope is probably no better. They, you know, this institution is kind of, they just cover up. It's what they've done for millennia, and it's what they will continue to do to you know, you just get me going on the child. I remember there was a scene in that movie that won the Academy Award. I think it was called Spotlight. There's a scene where the woman goes to the door of one of these old priests, and she says, "Is it true that you molested these boys?" And he's in some state of dementia, and his caregiver hasn't yet come to the door. So he says, "Oh, well, it was just oral. It wasn't penetration or something." He said something like, "Oh, it was no big, it was this, it wasn't that." So no, I didn't sin. And plus it was done to me when I was a child. And the way that with which he said it kind of broke my heart. I mean, obviously it's horrible, but of course he's a victim of it himself. Of course he is. It's so generational, right? Like every boy who was molested by a priest who became a priest molested boys. Like, it's just, it was, yeah, I don't even know what to say. The correlation between the childhood sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church and the JW are so extraordinary, and how courts have gotten away with it or have like somehow just let the churches get away with it for as long as they have, blows my mind. Yeah. There's a woman on the Supreme Court of the US, that Amy Comey Barrett or something. I did read, she is a member of the Charismatic Catholic Movement. She was raised in Charismatic, which kind of amused me, because it's just not mainstream, and it's not something people know a lot about. And sure enough, she, along with those other justices, were the ones that just reversed Roe v. Wade, and you know, they're going to do what they can to get religion embedded into politics as they do. Yeah.
We're living, unfortunately, at the wrong point in history. You know, again, religion is really, it's really present in politics and in our laws way too much. There's one final question. Okay. Typically, if I'm speaking to an ex-Jehovah's Witness like myself, I will ask them what they would say to any kind of on the fence Jehovah's Witnesses who might be watching. And so I guess in your case, I'd ask a similar question of, you know, what would be your message to either former members or current members of the Charismatic movement, or indeed Catholics who they may be watching your story and they're thinking, okay, that's an extreme case. You know, my Catholicism has manifested itself in a far more agreeable way that hasn't left any scars, and I'm totally fine with it. You know, you do you, I'll do me. What would be your message to a viewer like that?
The first thing that popped to mind was, I know that the main difference between Christianity and Catholicism is Christianity is belief-based. You have to believe Jesus is your personal savior. Catholicism is acts-based. It's based on behavior. I think even Mother Teresa was quoted as saying in her dying days, she didn't necessarily believe any of this, but she behaved as if she did. So she said her rosaries, she said her prayers, she went to mass. To be a good Catholic, you have to do a bunch of things that make you a good Catholic. And I would say, to a fence sitter, you know, I am a good person. My sister and I quip all the time. Like, I don't break any of the 10 commandments. I take a day off a week. I keep holy the Sabbath. I'm kind to my parents. Like, I'm a good person. I do good things every day. And I can still do those things. I can still be a kind person and live a good Christian life, a life well lived, and I can behave in good ways, but I don't have to behave. You know, it's the behavior that you're doing that's making you a Catholic. It's the rosaries you're saying, it's going to mass, it's thought stopping. A lot of it is those thought stopping techniques that kind of blow my mind. Like, you know, when you have a question, Google it or explore it or sit on it a while. You don't have to just think, oh, I shouldn't be thinking that. And yeah, I don't know what I would say to Catholics, because I know so many Catholics. I mean, I grew up Catholic, and a lot of my childhood friends are raising their children Catholic. It's free to send your kids to Catholic school here, so why not? To which I say, about the child sexual abuse scandals. How badly this institution behaves. Like, why? I don't know. It has to do with behavior versus belief, because I think you can still have a core set of beliefs, but you don't have to find to kind of like, sink your teeth into that institution. That institution is very corrupt. I will add one more thing here that I'm joking, but I have found a new religion, and I thought you, Lloyd, of all people, would appreciate it. This T-shirt says, "This is my religion," since 1906, and it's CPFC. It's Crystal Palace Football Club.
Oh, right, okay.
And I know you're a Man U fan, and I will say, in just at the end of all of this, that one of the things that Catholicism doesn't have is, at least in my experience, was I didn't have a sense of church community. Like, I don't remember going to church because, we baked casseroles for each other when each other's spouses were in hospital or whatever. Like, I don't know, a lot of people who are attracted to a religion like the church community, whereas I was very dogma based. I could go to, in fact, I remember being out of town and just going to some rando church because you had to go to church on Sundays. So just to behave like a Catholic, do the Catholic thing, believe the Catholic dogma. But it wasn't about the people. Anyway, since I became a football fan and I connected up with some expat Brits here, we're all Crystal Palace fans, I have a sense of community that I have never had in my life. And it's, we love the team with religious fervor. And there is a connection there. Like, we have each other's back. They will help me bury bodies. I'd help them. Like, it's an odd connection that I know humans need. Humans need to feel connected to other humans. And being the person that I was all those years, self-righteous, really, really to the detriment of friendships, be willing to just shun. I shunned and had no problems doing so. And now I just have this core group of friends, which is just kind of hilarious as a result of, the British Prem League, go figure.
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah. I have to say, you've surprised me that there's this community of Crystal Palace fans in Canada. I guess that's how universal football is, though, isn't it? I think that's fantastic. And, I'm obviously a Man U fan, and
yes.
I actually think that in a way that's sort of a religion to me, in that it doesn't make any rational sense whatsoever. I invest so much emotionally in the outcomes of football matches and whether certain trophies are won or not won and what position my team finishes in a league, and they don't give a crap about me. It's all completely one way.
You've devoted to this institution that doesn't care if you
yeah. It's religious in a weird sense, and I also I'm a massive Star Wars fan, and I often think I spend so much time thinking about this universe that doesn't exist and never has existed, although apparently it all happened in a galaxy far, far away a long time ago. I devote so much mental thought to these things, but I'm able to kind of rationalize and say none of it is real. I'm just enjoying the story. And I guess I wish that there was a way for people to view religion in the same way. In other words, rather than kind of see the need to lay down rules, not just for themselves, but for others. If they could just enjoy the story of it and the coming together of it without all of the judgmentalism and the abuse that we've been discussing, that would be fabulous, wouldn't it? But unfortunately, I don't see it happening.
Right. Yeah.
Well, that's a positive to end on, I guess. There is life beyond religion, and it's football and Star Wars.
100%. And I will say, there was I think during my deconversion years, I just was angry all the time. I just remember feeling I'm very hard on myself, and this guilt I feel. I judge myself very harshly And I didn't enjoy sports up until my late 40s. I remember mid 40s, I didn't watch football. I watched World Cup, but I never watched football because I felt like the sexism was overwhelming. It's all men, women aren't, But I remember one day giving myself a pass. I decided to forgive myself. I gave myself a pass and I said, Jo, you are allowed this one thing. You're allowed to enjoy football, and just forgive it. Forgive yourself for liking a sexist thing.
Yeah.
And just go. And then like I said, I just picked Palace. I mean, the story of how I became a Palace fan is kind of ridiculous, but whatever. I picked this mid-table this crappy team, and I love them, and I love Vera, and I love Pardew, and I love Zaha, and I love my friends. I love the community spirit. It brought me such joy in a way that I think religion brings a lot of people joy. Not me personally, but the storytelling, the soap opera, I didn't know football had, like, I remember when Mourinho and Chelsea were at odds, and that year that Leicester City won. It was a soap opera. It was like watching a really good show, just week after week, getting really into the details of it. But yeah, it's definitely a story, a soap opera that brings me joy. So
it's lovely to see that you've found your joy, despite
my religion.
A rough start, shall we say?
Yeah, indeed.
And I really appreciate you sharing your story on the channel. Thank you so much, Jo.
Thanks again. All right.
Viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this interview. I know I have. Don't forget that you can watch similar videos by subscribing to the Lloyd Evans channel, but that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching.